I'm Kat Armas. Thanks so much for having me on here. I'm really excited to chat with you. So, I am from Miami, Florida. I'm Cuban American. I was born and raised there before I moved to New Orleans to attend seminary. I didn't grow up in the evangelical church. I grew up culturally Catholic. So, when I made my transition to evangelicalism, and it was very much so fundamentalism, and coming from, as a Latina, as a Cuban in a very Cuban city, to the deep South, and being one of the only the only Cuban woman there. Yeah, it was just a huge shock for me. And so that kind of started my journey of writing about my experiences and making sense of my faith, being from a culture that's very matriarchal and being from somewhere where I was raised by my grandmother and my mother, and and then coming to a space where I had to very much submit to certain things was just very bizarre for me. So, I just started making sense of that. And so through that, I'm a writer. I'm currently working on my first book with Brazos Press. I also work for the Fuller Youth Institute, and I work on providing resources for young adults and teens in, just kind of going through adolescence and change. I'm currently living in Los Angeles, California. And so that's where I am quarantining from. And I am finishing up a Master of Divinity and a Master of Arts in Theology at Fuller Seminary.
Wonderful. Kat Armas, welcome to the Body Podcast. We're so glad that you're here with us. So yeah. I was introduced to some of your works. A friend of mine forwarded me an article you wrote called On Lamenting Why I'm Resisting Silver Linings During COVID-19. You listed off all of these different people groups and types of people that were suffering. You spared, no one. And I felt it was really honoring, and it was very thoughtful, and it was very compelling. All of the different types of suffering that are going on right now. You said, I wanted to feel it, because everything that's happening is worth sitting in the sadness. I just wanted to expand more on that. What has stopping and lamenting brought into your life that you have not had before?
To get to the place where I was able to kind of list off all the different people groups affected by this in different ways, right? I mean, you have racism that so many of our Asian and Asian American brothers and sisters are experiencing. You have the elderly who are already marginalized, and the disabled, and, young people. Like I said, I work with teens. And so just kind of hearing them like lamenting their prom and their, senior trip. I mean, putting myself in their position, I would, be devastated. And so I just started to really feel all of this, like, oh my goodness, everyone's being affected in their own way. And it's just this grand amount of loss. And not even to mention those who are sick and those who are passing away, and people who are dealing with, death in their family. I mean, it is just really atrocious. And it took me a while to kind of get to a place where I'm like, wait a minute, I'm grieving for all these people, but I was just really sad, and then people were like, well, at least your husband has 75% of his salary still there. And I'm like, thanks, but that doesn't help. Right now, that's not going to help me feel better. I am thankful for that, but I'll get there, right? Like I can't force myself to just be thankful for that. Just started to really feel these things, and friends and well-meaning family members would tell me, well, why don't you go for a walk, or why don't you try cooking, or why don't you try doing this? And I just didn't feel like it. I didn't feel like doing those things, because once it hit me, how the amount of suffering and the amount of grief and the amount of people going through different kinds of suffering and different kinds of grief and different kinds of losses, I realized, wait a minute, why should I pretend, get into my kitchen and force myself to cook something and put on, go for a run and pretend that everything's okay when it's just not? Or the death toll's rising. I know you're in New York, and just reading about your state and the amount of loss there, and just so much, I realized I don't want to rush past this. I want to sit and I want to feel this. It was necessary for my own health, for my own mental health, and to be a better neighbor and to be a better friend, to just sit in it, because it was worth it, right? There was so much loss and so much pain and so much grief. And we're so good at pushing past it and pretending that everything's okay, because we are a privileged nation, and because we are, for the most part, privileged people. And so we want to, pretend that it doesn't hurt. And so your second question, what has stopping and lamenting brought into my life that I didn't have before? The Bible, God calls us to, as we hear, and this is sort of this overused refrain, but mourn with those who mourn and weep with those who weep. And we kind of just throw that around, but we don't really do it because we hate to do it. And so I thought, I'm someone, as a Latina Cuban woman coming from a family who has been through a lot of lament and a lot of pain and a lot of grief in their past, and has sort of adopted this American exceptionalism since they've been here. But I quoted this in my blog post. N.T. Wright, he wrote an article on lament when this all started. He said that lament is what happens when people ask why and don't get an answer. It's where we get to when we move beyond our self-centered worry about our sins and failings and look more broadly at the suffering of the world. And so that really stood out to me. This is not just about me. I'm now feeling this about everybody right now in the entire country and the entire world. And it's the idea that we can kind of look past ourselves. We can look past our self-centeredness. We can look past our, 25% salary cut, or we can look past those things and recognize that there are people that are, for example, Black and brown bodies. I think it was in Detroit, every single person who has died from COVID is a Black person. I mean, that's huge, right? That tells you so much about systemic problems that are happening in our world and in our country. And I think that COVID is shining a light on these systemic issues. And so something that I've learned in its most simple and basic way is that this has allowed me and given me the opportunity to really, really, really weep with those who weep and mourn with those who are mourning, and allowed me to sit in these systemic issues that have been highlighted through COVID. The people that are really suffering, right? Like the farm workers who don't have access to healthcare, the undocumented who pay taxes, but are not receiving their, $1,200, whatever. I am grateful for the opportunity that this has allowed me to really see the suffering around me. As someone who I would consider myself a privileged person in many ways. In many ways I'm not, in many ways I am, but in the ways that I am privileged, I'm blinded to a lot of it a lot of the time.
There's a common enemy, right? And it doesn't have to be one another. When you stop fighting each other and you join forces and you fight the otherness, the enemy that is the sickness, that is the brokenness of this world, and you stick together. I'm just hoping it's a bridge between some of those divides. Maybe we'll be able to better hear each other on the other side of fighting this and having band forces and done it together. Do you have any advice to give to people who are having trouble lamenting? It's like asking someone to have empathy if they don't.
Right.
Maybe there's a better way to think about it, but there's a saying that you behave the way that you want to be, that you don't always necessarily need to feel something in order to start a habit or a practice. And so I wanted to speak into, techniques or remedies when you meet with friends who are just like, I had a friend recently tell me this, like, I need prayer. I just don't have any concern for my neighbors. And I'm like, that's the most honest prayer request. It's like, I just don't really worry about them. I just don't really care about my roommates. Just, it's very independent. I live in New York City. It's really independent lifestyle. But what advice do you have for those who are in fast-paced America, are used to #blessed, and are being forced to acknowledge that suffering is among us?
No, that's a good question. Definitely a difficult one to answer. So in the blog post that we're kind of referring to, I talk about this idea of American, and like you mentioned, American exceptionalism, and that's not something that just came out of nowhere, right? And I think, and I'll particularly focus on Christians because we're Christians, and this idea, I mean, from the inception of Christianity in our country, there has been this view of triumphalism and exceptionalism, and we are, like you said, #blessed. And that sort of faith or that sort of view is what justified genocide, right? That sort of view is what justified slavery. Like, we are, like God's chosen people. Therefore, whatever we do to these people or these bodies, how they suffer, I mean, whatever, it's God's will, right? I mean, so there's just so many ways that this sort of, that this belief system, I don't know what's the best way to call it, has been passed down to us. And something that I always say is that anything that we believe or anything that we think, any idea that we have about God is always going to directly affect people, like physical people, whether that's what you believe about atonement or whether that's what whatever it may be, that physically affects people, right? And a lot of the times people believe things and they don't even know why they believe it. I've seen a lot of people on Twitter and some people say, like, I don't know who needs to hear this, but God didn't send COVID just to teach you a lesson. And I firmly believe that. But that happened, like, we think people start thinking that, right? Christians are trying to make sense of these things, and it's because of what we believe. Like, everything is for like some spiritual platitude or some, and a lot of times it's like, well, things just suck right now, and it really just sucks. And maybe instead of jumping to some sort of lesson or trying to, just let's think about what we believe, why we believe it, why we're trying to jump to this gratitude or these silver linings. Like, why can't we just sit in the funk? And I personally believe it's because of our history of American exceptionalism within Christianity. So to answer your question, what advice do I have? Well, I think that, and this is for everybody, not just for times of COVID or times of quarantine, but really think, why do you believe what you believe, right? Like, let's go back to, a lot of us talk about deconstruction or decolonizing our faith. That's something that I talk a lot about. And when I talk about decolonizing my faith, I talk about untangling from those roots, right? Untangling from whether it be American exceptionalism, Christian exceptionalism, untangling myself from that. And so that I'm able to see the grief, the hurt, the pain, so that I'm able to see the suffering of those in my community, those around me. And once I'm able to do that, once I'm able to decolonize or deconstruct or untangle from these things, and able to really, really, really see, hey, what is happening around me? Why are, I think I mentioned this also in the blog post, but Walter Brueggemann talks about how victory is the song of the haves, but the have-nots, their struggle, lament is sort of their refrain, right? And that's so true for the majority of the world. The majority of the world lives in a have-not position, but yet because we live in a have position, we can't get there. We can't see that. So anyway, first step I would say is just, why do you believe what you believe? What has privilege done to us? How has it blinded us? Privilege is this weird thing, right? That sometimes we have it, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we have more of it, sometimes we have less of it. And always, where am I on this, COVID privilege scale? I don't know, like where and right now, and what is it that I need to think about, and how can I envision myself in my neighbors and my communities shoes, those who are, losing a lot. I was actually talking to a friend recently, and she said, I've been feeling really guilty lately, and I've been fighting against my guilt because I have really high anxiety and I'm an introvert. And how a lot of people are struggling with being home. She's like, that's how I feel about being out. Like, when I'm in crowds, I'm always so anxious and I hate it. And she's like, and I'm home right now and I feel awesome and I feel great, but I feel bad that I feel so good that I don't have to be in crowds, right? But even something like that, I'm like, wow, I didn't, yes, that's so, because I love being in crowds, right? So I'm like, oh, thank you, and trying to understand, okay, these are all these perspectives, and we don't have to feel shame about feeling them. Like you said, like your friend who was like, I'm struggling, and I think that that's honest and that's raw. But maybe let's ask ourselves, what is keeping us from empathizing with our neighbor? Is it our privilege? What aspects of our privilege? Is it this or what, why do we believe what we believe? How can we get to the root of that? What do we need to deconstruct? Or that's something that has helped me, at least, to understand why I struggle with certain things.
We love to talk about the book of Job in our faith. It's one of the first and oldest books of the entire Bible. And it's so beautiful. And it's where we turn to, and the stories that we tell our kids, and how he lost everything, he got it all back. And I think at the end of the day, a lot of people who believe in Jesus, they don't want to be Job. I have to be honest, I just never wanted to be him. I wanted, my prayers have been literally filled through the past, like, God, please spare me of suffering. We don't want to be Job. We're Job's friends. So we give all this really bad terrible, theologically loaded, and really off advice about why Job's suffering. And I think we've been comfortable with that. We're going to be Job's friends with horrible theology. And God actually wants us to bring us into the opportunity to be Job and forever changed. The book ends with women getting an inheritance like the sons. I mean, what does that remind you of?
Right.
The new coming kingdom. He's not the same man he was at the beginning of the book. Something happened to that man, and he changed, and he realized how women felt. And so he's like, why am I following culture and putting these weird standards of what women are allowed to have? I went through hell and back. I'm not the same man I was. So you know what? I'm giving the women in my family an inheritance the same as the men. That was culturally insane. Yeah, you've inspired me, Kat. I think, what will we be like at the end of this Job season? Where will we be so much better off because we were broken? Who will we give money to? Who will we have empathy for? Since your blog post, but I wanted to hear if there was anything that you've learned since then. God enlightened anything further on your heart regarding suffering and lamenting and mourning this season?
Kind of to go back to that Job thing, I really liked what you shared. So thank you for that. Stepping into this lament and just sitting in the funk and allowing myself to feel the just sadness. What if, like, without us trying to over spiritualize this, but yes, what if our world could transform, right? Through this, because of this, our world could transform if we allowed ourselves to be tender, to be broken, to name our losses, not only for ourselves, but those in our community, to resist the urge to jump to quick fixes, to learn to listen to the voices who have been sounding the alarm. A lot of women, a lot of people of color have been sounding the alarm when it comes to, like I was mentioning before, systemic issues like this, right? They've been saying, hey, our system is broken, and if we don't do something about it, it's just going to be really bad. Well, that's happening, right? So people have been sounding the alarm, and again, our privilege or whatever you want to call it, we haven't been listening, right? And not necessarily us, but I'm kind of just saying as a society as a whole, we have not been listening. And so perhaps, this could help us to tune our ear to specific voices that have been sounding alarms that we should have been listening to. And something that I wrote here, what if we not only learn to listen to the voices who have been crying out from the margins in dependence on God, but join them in their hope of seeing a more just society, right? Because like I said, people have been on the margins crying out for a more just society. And maybe this season can be a time where we can join people who, like I said, have been sounding the alarm, and we can see our world transform through this. And so to answer your question, the few months where I was able to just kind of sit there and be sad and feel it, and not be sad for no reason other than, there was a lot of things to be sad about, and just feel the tension and feel the pain, I really felt like I was able to get to a place where now I'm okay. And now I can, hey, call a friend, how are you doing? Like, let me be there for you. Let me offer something to you, because I've felt it and I've sat there and I've allowed myself to be there and I've allowed myself to feel it. And so now I'm so thankful that I'm able to be a better friend, a better neighbor, a better person in my church community, because I gave myself the chance to just kind of, hey guys, I can't help you right now because I'm struggling, right? And through that process, now I'm able to, be there for other people who may be now going through that or struggling to get there, right? So anyway, I would say that I have learned that gratitude does come. Maybe silver linings do come. Maybe they don't. But if they do, I think it'll take time, and we shouldn't rush to get there.
Kat, you had mentioned you have a book coming out. When is it going to be released? What's it called? And what can you tell us about it?
A little love project that I'm working on. So it won't be out until summer of 2021. I'm in the very beginning stages of it, but it's with Brazos Press, and it's titled Abuelita Faith, tentatively titled Abuelita Faith, Stories of Survival, Strength, Resistance, and Persistence. Through that, I am sharing my grandmother's story of immigration, and I'm kind of arguing for this idea of, so it was birthed out of my research in Mujerista and womanist theology. And through that, I found this little sort of, like I said, I'm Cuban American, I'm Latina. And so in Latino, in small Latino circles, there's this thing called Abuelita Theology, which is grandmother theology. That, once I started reading about this, and only a few scholars have sort of mentioned it here and there, and it so caught my attention because, like I said, I grew up culturally Catholic, but my grandmother, I mean, she was the beacon of faith and spirituality for my family. And I didn't come to evangelicalism until I was an adult, but now looking back and able to see how my grandmother's faith really sustained me and brought me to where I am now. And not only, brought me to where I am in my beliefs and my thoughts about God, but led me to deconstruction and decolonization. And now to, this new sort of understanding of who God is. And so I'm sharing her story of immigration alongside stories of women in the Bible who I consider Abuelita theologians, so grandmother theologians, and they are overlooked or unnamed women. And so I think it's really important to highlight, I feel like so many unnamed and overlooked people in society who are not considered theologians because of their socioeconomic status, their gender, their race. But they, I believe, carry the deepest and most profound truths about God through their lived experience, right? Not through their education about God. I'll have 2 masters in a couple weeks and I could say all of these fancy words about God. But in a lot of ways, my grandmother, she has the lived experience to tell me about God. And so I want to highlight those voices, particularly in scripture. So I just wrote a chapter yesterday on the daughters of Zelophehad, and I wrote on Aksa, and I'm sharing, how they, through their stories of resistance, right? Resisting empire, resisting power, through their stories of survival, just trying to survive, right? Through their stories of persistence, kind of going back and facing power, facing patriarchy, facing all of these things over and over and over again. I am arguing that in and of itself is holy. And there's so many times in scripture where you see God blessing those moments of resistance, those moments of persistence. And so that's what my book is about. And so I'm really excited about it.
I am so excited. You have no idea. And just to even hear you say that, to challenge earthly powers is a holy endeavor, especially when it's in defense of those who hold the treasures and mysteries of heaven in their heart, despite the fact they don't have, Jesus called fishermen and he hung out with prostitutes.
Right, exactly.
You can't read a book and get this. It's a miracle. Faith is a gift. It's a mystery. And I cannot wait to read your book.
Oh, thank you.
I've been to the Cat Armas website, which is beautiful.
Thank you.
Where else could we find out more about your podcast, your book, your blog?
Yeah, so my website, of course, catarmas.com. And then I'm also on Twitter and Facebook at cat_armas. Twitter is sort of like my favorite platform to chat and kind of go back and forth. And then, so you can follow me on those platforms. I also host the Protagonistas podcast, where I highlight women of color in church leadership and theology. And the same idea, right? Women who are overlooked or unrecognized, who are just doing really, really cool things in church. That is, like I said, the Protagonistas.
It's such a cool title.
Yeah, that was birthed from my study of Mujerista theology, which is liberation theology from a Latina woman perspective. And something that I've noticed is that, or the mother of Mujerista theology, Ada Maria Sassi Diaz, she talks about how women are often, although it's their stories are often told for them, or they somehow become objects of their own stories. And so the whole idea is that we want women, marginalized women, to become protagonists of their own stories, to tell their own stories. And so thus the Protagonistas was born.
More that we can encourage women to stand by their own testimony, their own words. And the more that we all do it together, and the more that we all cheer each other on while we do it, the more that that slow change that I know we really both want. Anytime I grieve about the way that it's been difficult for women to work in ministry, and there's tears shed and mourning for sure, I just remember like God cries first. And if he's motivating my heart to feel grief, to him looking down from heaven on this hot mess with the genders in the church, like he is with us. So in that spirit, keep going with your book.
Thank you.
And I will just be over here cheering you on and praying for perseverance and protection while you do this brave endeavor.
Thank you so much. That means the world to me, really. Thank you. And yeah, like you said, we're all doing this together. We're on the same team, and we're, pushing for the same sort of just society, world future. So yeah, thank you so much.
What a pleasure to hear more of your thoughts today. So everybody check out Kat's website, her blog, her podcast.
This was great. Yeah. Thanks so much for all your wonderful questions.
Safe quarantine in California.
All right. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too.